Thursday evening, everyone. It is the day after the red wave. We are joined today by political legends in Maryland. We are joined by Governor Ehrlich, governor from 2002 to 2007, the great state of Maryland. And we're coming up with 20 years since the governor was inaugurated. And we're joined by my old friend from the college days, Scott English. How are you doing, guys? Take it away, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. And if there was a red wave, it turns out that there was also a blue undertow that at least a lot of Republicans were not expecting. Gentlemen, what do you think happened? Start with you, Governor. I know you've got a number of thoughts to get off.
Yeah, before you came on pre-show, I told these guys that I just woke up this morning not too happy and just wrote a few things down, whatever came to my brain. Just a couple of one, early voting and mail-in voting continue to help Democrats, period. We have not made the case convincingly to the general public. Extended early voting it's really problematic. And you saw it in this with Fetterman. So many people had cast their vote prior to the time, and you're telling me that last debate wouldn't have turned a few of those votes? Give me a break. So extended early voting, I think, and in Arizona, you had a libertarian candidate get after almost 1 million people had voted. So again, early days fine, but weeks, months, years of early voting, enough. Second observation, the progressive left, I think, as a result of this election, despite the fact they lost the House and may indeed lose the Senate, who knows, underperformed. That's the bottom line to this election. Republicans underperformed, even if we gain both. Progressive left, presently in charge of the Democratic Party, is going to continue. This agenda was on the ballot this cycle. The porous border and cashless bailouts and voting rights and the war on fossil fuels and the displacement of classroom and extreme abortion positions. We thought that was the agenda. That's very hard left progressive agenda would fuel Republicans and independents. Not the case. Clearly, abortion played a much larger role in this election than many Republicans. A couple last observations here. This was a tough pill for the Republican because demonstrated failure was not punished at the polls. And typical failure, and by any measure, these last 2 years have demonstrated failure. The polls reflected that. 3/4 of the American public, the great poll question, right track, wrong track, the country's on the wrong track. And yet, likely, quick winners or losers. Long Island Republicans, big winners, 4 for 4. Biden had a pretty good night. I would say he was a winner. Ron DeSantis had a really good night. Carrie Lake is going to end up having a good night. President Trump, not so much. Say with regard to the country is more divided than ever.
Scott, what are your thoughts?
Man, how do I follow that? Look, I think that there's a tough love moment in all of this for us, and that is, I happen to be on a successful campaign where a candidate knocked off a sitting governor, which, in political terms is near impossible to do. It's incredibly difficult to do. But the reason why we were able to do it isn't just that we were able to point out that he wasn't on the right track, that he wasn't doing a good job, but that we provided a viable alternative. Let me offer up some tough love for our Republican Party. If you go back to, say, 1994, when we had the first 2 disastrous years of the Clinton administration, Governor Ehrlich, you and my old friend Mark Sanford both got elected to the class of 1994 on the backs of not just the idea of how bad things were, but how we were going to make them better. You look at the conditions that we have in this election cycle, all right? We've got 40-year historic high inflation, and you can only blame one party for that. You have gas prices that are astronomically high with no viable solution coming from the White House on what exactly to do to deal with that, other than releasing gas from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which, quite frankly, I think is a failed policy. Third, you have a legitimate issue in discussing the southern border and how exactly we want to approach that. Now, let me ask you this question, and this is the ultimate tough love moment. What in the hell were we going to do? Right? We had no real answers to any of this stuff. We paid lip service at best to fiscal discipline, which we know is the number one reason why inflation is where it is. Those massive spending bills that came out of Washington, D.C. over the last couple of years have really driven up costs. Two, the failure to lead on COVID, both by the Republicans when Donald Trump was in the White House, and subsequently, other than outside of a couple of different states, say Brian Kemp in Georgia and Ron DeSantis in Florida, you don't really have any cogent policy that comes together of saying, not only are we not going to do something, but we're actually going to do something better. So I think we've got to have a moment of inflection here where we look at our own leadership, starting with Kevin McCarthy in the House, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, and quite frankly, Donald Trump down in Florida, and say, what are you guys doing for us? Right now, I see nothing going for us. We should have won in an actual wave, and we did not. We failed.
I will say this, your point's well taken. I will say with regard to a couple of other issues, we're way out in front. The border, Republicans are way out in front and have been out in front, and that issue did not resonate. And was particularly disappointing to me, especially after Virginia, Scott, last year, power movement, which Republicans have appropriately joined groups around the country in regaining control of local education, which is the appropriate position on that. Republican candidates, and I think it's the right position. Obviously, it's a culture war we win, quite frankly. But that again, for some reason, again, did not impact the bottom line very often. At least in the races we needed to win. Just looking forward here, I think, and this is mostly good news, to occur. Republican control of the House and either party. We simply don't. Very little is going to be accomplished over the next 2 years. So very little additional damage can get done. Manchin is going to feel real free. My prediction is going to be, I'm going out on a limb on this one, just free to vote with Republicans and feel free to vote with Republicans more than ever, given what's leadership just ended up doing to him this past cycle. And one very, Scott, we need to talk about it because I'm a Jack Kemp guy. You may probably know that Jack always has been my hero, will always be my hero. And Jack Kemp talked about that color party that he always dreamt of, especially with regard to Hispanic. Under Donald Trump has now accelerated again this cycle. More Hispanics, especially being the differentiating factor in many of these close races, more among Hispanic voters for Republicans than we've ever seen. It's transformational, I should say. And if it continues, will lead to a the parties in this country.
Yeah, I think there's I think you're right about that. I mean, look, you talk about Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp was there when I was a young, formative man on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And one of the things that ultimately brought me to the Republican Party, even though my parents, who may be watching tonight, so I'm going to apologize for bragging about being a Republican again. But, the reason why they brought me to the party was because I viewed that as a young man on the Eastern Shore as an opportunity party. And, that is to some, if you individualize some candidates out there, I think they resonate on that message. You talk about Youngkin, the power of the education choice movement in the Virginia election last year should not have been ignored in a lot of the discussions we were pushing on the national stage. We saw what COVID did, what the lockdowns did in terms of the education. And that was a reason right then and there to say, look, we've got to double down on school choice, not ignore it or pretend like it's just sort of a baseline assumption that people want to be there. I think that's a powerful message with a group of people, both Blacks with Hispanics, that carries a lot of resonance, and we need to really focus in on messages like that and talk more about it.
Yeah,
Going back
I mean,
to
there's really, I think just to put a exclamation mark on that last comment by Scott, and they're both winners, quite frankly, with those groups and every other group for that matter. One is, as you know, it's school choice, and the other is to get lost when you're talking about you're between me and my kid in that classroom, and to my lack of ability to impact local curricula in the local public school for children. Give me a break. I mean, I thought what turned the Youngkin race, as you know, is McCall, for the first time maybe ever, told the Virginia publics really view the issue, what they really think, when he said literally butt out parents. Listen, I do not degrade teachers. Teacher coaches were the difference in my life and so many lives. Teachers love teachers. We send our kid to public school, our second kid. I've seen, especially they have with poor kids and working class kids, it is dramatic. But teachers unions are all around this country, and as I said earlier, this is an issue. This culture of 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, and this whole curriculum battle culture where we did not start, but we have to win. So I see that issue basically as two choice and appropriate instruction.
Look, I think if anybody objectively who's been through the public school system can say, the biggest problem with the education system today is that the adults in the system care more about the adults in the system than they do about the children in the system. And I think I worked in education after I left the governor's office in South Carolina, and I was on the front lines of this issue, and consistently and repeatedly. Again, I think there are a lot of very dedicated teachers out there. Unfortunately, once you leave that classroom and you start dealing with school administrators, you start dealing with people at higher and higher up on the food chain, and that includes the school boards that are out there. All they care about is fighting for the adults in the system and forget, number one, the most important constituency in any school system is the child. And without that, we are lost on education. And I think the test results that we're looking at right now, based on all of the, again, adults influencing the policy far more over the last 2-3 years, or even beyond that. But I mean, especially with the COVID lockdown, we're watching a generation of students now who are already woefully behind, and we have no plan to catch them up.
Yep. I wanted to go back to talk about going back to 94, which was, I thought, first of all, Scott, I thought you made a great point before about the need to have particular proposals to talk about what you're for in order to address the problems that people are concerned about. And it struck me back in 94 when you were elected governor to Congress, there was a plan. There was the contract with America that laid out some very specific issues that were going to be addressed. Is that something we can do? And how do we approach that on issues like the economy and inflation?
I think Scott's point's well taken, but I don't size it because the general rule still applies here. And this is what upsets me so much about this election with regard to the party in power is a referendum on the party in power. So typically in midterms, Scott, you know this, it's not always the case where we're not them. We can throw spitballs from the bleachers and get elected. And for the most part, with America, and it was a big deal, and it gave us something to talk about. But people were down all the scandals. They were down on policy issues at the time. So it's not always the case. You need some great agenda out there. Scott's well taken, and I totally agree with regard to inflation and spending. Throw spitballs from the bleachers this cycle. It was, hey, here's how we got here, and here's how.
Let me counterpoint that and say, look, in 1994, let's use that as the contrast year because that was a significant year for Republicans. And I just want to take a moment of silence right now to say goodbye to the last Republican elected in that class who was leaving the House of Representatives, and Steve Shabbat, who lost this election cycle. The rest of us have all moved on with our lives, but Steve was still back there holding the wall up, and unfortunately he's gone.
But Scott, Steve's one in long, could be back. Who knows?
That's true. He is. He's been here before too. So, but my point is that in 1994, we, with a wink and a nod, said to our voters, "Look, we're going to investigate the shit out of the Clinton White House. But while we're doing that, here's things you should be talking about with your family and friends about immigration, about welfare reform, about the balancing the budget, and those sorts of things." This election was the flip coin of that, which is we were out there promoting that we were going to investigate the shit out of the Biden administration. And oh, by the way, maybe we might do some policy stuff while we're at it. That's my point, which is your lead punch always matters. And I think that if you didn't arm some voters who were persuadable with something to talk about, Mehmet Oz, and I live in Pennsylvania now, Mehmet Oz had nothing but defense. He was talking about inflation, except his execution of it was so bad, it was ridiculous. And at the same time, Fetterman, who'd had my God, he lost to a man who had a stroke. It makes me think back to the primary again, where David McCormick, my preferred candidate in the race, should have won. And were it not for the interference of outside forces, and I won't blame President Trump, but he can take the responsibility for this one. If it weren't for that, we absolutely would have been able to win this race. It was a winnable race, and we blew it.
I guess the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which a lot of Republicans are not going to want to talk about, played a part here. And for the most part, Republicans ignored it. Look, we're always going to get smacked by young women on election day. The trend has been there forever, but that trend was particularly pronounced this cycle.
Yeah, I think abortion, it's the Obamacare debate all over again, right? Which is we were going to repeal and replace. And when we got the majority in the House in 2010, we were all ready to repeal, but we didn't have a replace. And same thing in 2014. And the same thing is here. You and I are both dedicated pro-life advocates, but at the same time, I can't believe that we spent 50 years trying to get rid of Roe v. Wade, which I do believe was the right decision by the court. But then we didn't really say, well, then what are we going to do? It was just sort of, we're all going to go out and celebrate this. I think that America sees our point of view much more clearly on the abortion issue, and yet we all ran away from it as though it was something we never, ever wanted to talk about.
I think I do agree with that position. And the fact we ran away from it is now history because we did. So, looking forward, I do think not a whole lot is going to get done over the next 2. Joe Biden, I think a positive for Republicans is going to be, although I said this a few weeks ago too, this agenda is a failure. Gosh, I'll go over on election day. But I think the progressives are going to double down. The new Joe Biden, as opposed to within Congress, this new progressive Joe Biden, either believes this stuff actually, or I don't know what it is, but I do know this. Bernie Sanders is actually the president of the United States, at least his philosophical underpinnings, his values. And you hear it every day out of the White House. So even though they screwed him twice, he actually won. The problem is when Bernie wins, America wins. So I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of right track, wrong track. It's generally going to be wrong track. It's going to be progressive ideas that get rejected by us. And then we're going to have this big fight come 2024.
I think you're right. I'm sorry. Just one last point. I just want to say this. I think you're right that there is an opportunity for Republicans, even though these election results were bad, looking ahead to the next Congress. The good news is this. Number one, we are definitely going to control the House. I think barring some meteorite strike on half the candidates that just got elected, we're going to control the House. The Senate maybe is going to be 51-49 if we're lucky Republican. It's going to be 50-50 if we're not. But I do agree. I think there are 2 senators on the Democratic side that are gettable for us. And even though we may not necessarily run the show in the Senate, I think we can control a lot of the debate and the way the ball moves if Republicans are savvy enough to reach out to Sinema and to Joe Manchin on a regular basis and say, hey, we've got your back on this stuff. Let's make this happen.
Yeah, I guess. Bottom line with Bob and Kendall was a cheap plug for the podcast there. 2 years ago, anointed Joe Manchin the most important person in the world. Burned. Joe Manchin has been burned by the Progressive Caucus in the House, or conned or believed mistakenly, whatever, A, B, C, or all the above. With that big deal, he would get that pipeline through West Virginia. The Greens in the House would not agree. Joe Manchin, you saw his reaction, his immediate, the president's statement the other day concerning coal. Joe Manchin is feeling the time to get Joe Manchin to switch parties, quite frankly.
And he's up in the next 2-year cycle, and he's soft target number one for the Republican Party because West Virginia really does favor the Republicans far more than it does the Democrats, and so he's got to do his own political calculation on the logic of that. Switching parties would probably be enough to save him and maybe avoid a primary challenge. But McConnell can cut a deal like that. But at the same time, you just gotta convince Manchin that it's in his best interest to either become a Republican or vote like one.
Well, we must get because he's sitting alone in the corner, or not getting the memos when the caucus. I mean, the pro-coal caucus in the Democratic Party is very, or the pro-fossil fuels caucus in the Democratic Party these days.
So let me be a little provocative about the Republican agenda. So post 2016, when Republicans were in the White House and in Congress, we were not as, how shall I say, spending restrained as we Republicans historically were. And basically both parties endorsed spending more money. Certainly that was one of the things that took place during COVID. Are we going to trigger an internal debate within the party about returning to sort of the fiscal discipline as being one of the core principles?
Say this, Scott, let me, I talked about this a bunch. So the first, that lack of spending restraint, that lack of fiscal conservatism reflected the view. President Trump never pretended to be a fiscal hawk. He actually said it. Republicans went along, and the fact that the rest of the agenda was so successful and the country was so much on the right track, and there's so much revenue was being produced because we're doing well in the whole 9 yards, we just lost track of one of the foundations. So with regard to whether DeSantis or Pompeo or someone else, folks with more of a pedigree along the lines of fiscal conservatism. Now, if it's President Trump, saw 4 years ago and 8 years ago, but if it's anyone else, especially takes great pride in his fiscal restraint, I think you're going to see a renewed emphasis.
This is the favorable time. I mean, think about when we took over in '94 and we battled Clinton. I mean, granted, the shutdowns we had in '95 had consequences to them. But at the end of the day, you got to think that we got the Balanced Budget Act out of it. We actually got tax cuts out of it. We got him to agree to any number of spending restraints that went along with that.
Welfare
and so this welfare reform, I mean, those were huge wins for us in the 90s. The problem with, and we saw this with the Bush administration too, when we controlled all branches of both branches of government at the same time. It's the golden rule in Washington. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so we love to spend when we're in power. Howard Phillips used to speak about this, that Democrats, that Republicans grew government and Democrats perfected it. And, he was right about that. And so I do hope, and I do think, with Biden in the White House and the Republicans at least controlling the House, that we have an opportunity to renew that discussion, and we absolutely must. I mean, think about this: when Trump was elected, his first move was to name Mick Mulvaney as the OMB director. And you think, okay, fine, we've got the fiscal hawk of fiscal hawks sitting in the Office of Management and Budget to really start burrowing in on government spending. And then Trump said, but we can't touch Medicare and we can't touch Social Security. Well, we're not talking about balancing the budget anymore. We're talking about, nibbling around the edges. So we've got to have and I know politically it can be viewed as a loser to talk about entitlement spending, but if we don't, you realize that the number one mandatory spending category is going to become debt service. And that's the thing that we have got. Yeah, we have got to get this under control, and we've got to do it now, because if you can't sit here and point at Republicans and say they want to cut Social Security when in reality, time itself is going to cut Social Security when we run out of money in the trust fund in another decade.
Two thoughts. People forget Monica Lewinsky is the one who actually credit for stopping the conversation with regard to, because there were secret meetings at the time between President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich. And as you know, Scott, you recall, those conversations have begun and approaching an issue quietly, but substantively from what by the way, my line I used on many occasions running for Congress. Once I got there and saw, I came from a state legislature, where you couldn't print money until you really had to follow the rules, a 90-day session. You had to support your committee on the floor and get out of control. You had a single issue rule where you couldn't dress bills up as Christmas trees. So my line, Republicans are the party of big government, and Democrats are the really, really big government. And that.
Well, you're right. Talking about 98. Because I worked for Sanford then, and Sanford was Mr. Social Security Reform in the House, and we were part of that set of meetings that was going on with regard to entitlement reform. I remember in 98 going to the White House 2 weeks before we impeached the president and having this discussion on Social Security reform. And, we're done with this. And Gene Sperling and Larry Summers sort of cornered me in Sanford and just say, bottom line, look, if he gets impeached, we can't have this conversation anymore. And that's what Mark and I put a lot of energy into. And so you're sort of given this choice of impeach the president or no Social Security reform. We ultimately we walked the plank on impeachment because we had to. It was the right thing to do, and I don't apologize for that. But you're right, we did sacrifice a very critical moment as a result of that. But you got to blame Bill Clinton first for that.
But you also, in that area, even had some liberals, and let alone some Democrats, willing to engage in those discussions. You don't have that anymore. No.
I mean, my God, Sam Beard, who worked for Bobby Kennedy, was the leading liberal advocate for Social Security reform. I mean, that's fairly powerful. You don't have things like that anymore. We have polarized ourselves that much.
That's when liberals actually existed, not progressives, because last time I checked, liberals on milk cartons.
So let's look forward within the Republican Party. There's been obviously a lot of chatter. If you were going to try and distill the conventional wisdom over the last 24 hours, it is that Ron DeSantis had a great day yesterday, and President Trump not so much. And obviously, there seems to be some expectation that they're the two big elephants in the room that are going to fight it out for the 2024 election. First of all, is that a fair analysis? And what are your thoughts, if so, about handicapping that internal race within the party?
Question. So I'm not going to do it. I talked to a senior man, and we had a very blunt discussion, and everybody's nervous, and nobody has to address it. We shouldn't address it. So we shouldn't play Scott. I don't believe we should play the press as the media. Things aren't going to go so well in the country in the next couple of years, but they're going to play this game where they split our party, the DeSantis guy, whatever. So I don't think we should play that game. Right now, we should let it play. We need to get through this election cycle first. Okay. We need to get our act together second. I think President Trump and DeSantis, Governor DeSantis dominate the terrain. If you're asking me for a third name, I think Mike Pompeo has a lot of fans in this party. I'm one of them all, but I think a lot of us like them all. So my thought at this point is right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's I've never been a Trump fanatic. I've never been an anti-Trump, a never Trumper. I'm there when he's on my side. I'm not there when he's not on my side. But I've been that way about every Republican that's been out there. Just sometimes I'm never a blind loyal guy. I do think that his influence over the election cycle was too oversized, but that's my message is that you can't live under the umbrella of Donald Trump for the rest of your life. We have to be a party of a deep bench. And I do think that where we've seen leadership in Brian Kemp, who did a phenomenal job in getting reelected in Georgia last night, Ron DeSantis, who did a wonderful job of not only did he get reelected, but he carried some pretty deep coattails. I mean, you look at the congressional makeup of Florida today versus what it was yesterday, it's pretty dramatic in its change. You've got Greg Abbott down in Texas, who has been doing a very good job, even though it's a little bit more low key. And so I do think we've got a deep bench, something we can celebrate a little bit more. Right now, the Democrats sort of run full circle from the almost 80-year-old president back to the almost 80-year-old president again, because they've run the track around to look at all of the other people that might be a choice for them. And they just settle back on Biden again. And so we know that the only reason why Biden is even remotely being discussed as a candidate for 2024 is because who else are they going to run?
Well, hey, Scott, that's a good point with you. You make a great point, but this election cycle knocked off a bunch of was allegedly one of their stars. Abrams, one of their stars. Demings, clearly one of their stars. I mean, they had a bunch of their up-and-coming stars knocked off this cycle.
I mean, look, the Democrats are great about having stars every cycle that end up getting. I mean, 2 years ago, it was Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, and they gave him, over $100 million to run in a race, which in a state where no one's ever had to spend more than about $20 million to get elected. And not only did Jamie Harrison lose, but the Republicans actually picked up seats in the House. I mean, it was a killing field for them. So Beto O'Rourke is another example. Stacey Abrams, you're right, is a prime example of that. They fall in and out of love so quickly with these rock stars, and they prove to be nothing more than stuffed suits or vacuum cleaners for money that come from national Democrats to no end. They don't care about results in the Democratic Party. We already know that.
But throw a kudo out to a guy who lost with coattails, positive coattails, Lee Zeldin coattails. You can credit those Republican pickup seats along Long Island directly to Lee Zeldin, and what a strong candidate he is and was this election cycle. Impossible state, we know that. He ran a terrific race. I think he's a terrific candidate myself. On TV, so I hope there's a role for him going forward in our party.
Yeah, if there's ever malpractice, I mean, the Democrats had total control of the redistricting process in New York, and yet you still got the results that you got in this, last night in the election. Albany is definitely not smarter than anywhere else in the state. That's clearly been demonstrated here, and I think Zeldin did energize a lot of voters to show up and vote, and that made a difference in a lot of critical races there.
So, just let me go back to presidential politics. Now, I guess there had been some expectation that, if it was the red wave, that Biden would have to pivot and we would have to open up Democratic primaries. Is Biden safe in 2024, or are we still going to come back and a year from now see a Democratic primary? Anyone want to handicap the Democrats?
I'll jump on that one. Why not? It's fun. I think he's got internal problems right now. They're going to celebrate, but I think that there's two things happening. One is the White House has been positively tone deaf to the rest of the Democrats out there. Let's not forget, even though this didn't become a red wave, there's still a lot of Democrats that got sort of thrown out on the tarmac at the expense of the White House in this election cycle. And he was able to save a couple of critical races, but there's still a lot of damage that was done to the party overall. And that was true in 2020 as well. Even though he won the White House, their margin in the House got smaller. And then that's before you even start looking at legislative races around the country where Republicans absolutely dominated the party. So there is a degree of tone deafness there, and I think that's going to reach its frustration point sooner or later, especially when I think in these next 2 years, a lot of what Biden is trying to do is going to stall. And I think the economy is going to go south.
You're picking up on your earlier statement. That's true, but their bench is there, and if he wants to run, their bench is thin, and it's today and thinner than it was 2 days ago.
That's true, but I mean, think about it this way. Look at the 92 election cycle, which is George H.W. Bush got the nomination again, but not without getting damaged badly by Pat Buchanan in a primary as a result of it. And I do think that there's the potential for that to happen in this next election cycle, whether it's a Jared Polis who got reelected in Colorado last night, or even Gavin Newsom, who is equally as egomaniacal as Joe Biden is.
Hey, I got to get to sleep tonight, pal. I got to sleep tonight, okay?
So I do think that there's the potential of a Democrat who's saying, look, I don't think they get it in Washington, D.C. I think I'm a better alternative. We need to get rid of the old man, and Kamala Harris isn't the next best option there. So I'm going to cast my lot and see what happens. And yeah, there'll be a 30% candidate, no doubt about it, but it's a broadside no matter what.
Yeah, agreed.
So let's turn to local elections. Obviously, we have a new governor here in Maryland, and you have a new governor in Pennsylvania. Any thoughts about what all that means for people in Pennsylvania and in Maryland? I'll let you go, whoever wants to go first on that.
A progressive state just got more progressive. No big news here. But again, I have my Congressional District 6, Neil Parrott, a race going down to the wire. Eyes on Anne Arundel County Executive here. Republicans in Maryland, Scott, picked up executive races this cycle, and there's one here and in Anne Arundel County that's also going down to the wire as well.
I think the Parrott race is really interesting. You had a very competitive Republican primary there. Well, not very competitive. It got a lot of attention outside of Maryland. I'll put it that way. But that's a plus 10 Biden district, though. And for Parrott to be at this point in the race in that position is remarkable. I think that says a lot about his candidacy and what he did there. I will say this. Maryland reverts back to its natural state, right? This is the Democratic dominated state I grew up in. Although I do want to point out that Dan Cox, not my preferred candidate in the race, but ultimately I'm not a Maryland voter anymore. His vote total, just think about this for a second, Governor. When you ran for statewide office, you did remarkably well, right? You won one election, you lost one election through no fault of your own. It was the 2006 cycle. It was rough for everybody. But Dan Cox got the lowest number of votes for a Republican candidate since 1990 when William Shepard ran. I don't know if you remember Bill Shepard when he ran, but he picked his wife to be the lieutenant governor candidate. That's how wonderfully bucolic the Republican Party was back in 1990. His best running mate was his wife, and he still got more votes and more percentage than Dan Cox did last night.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but the bottom, you've lived this. Your entire life defines this observation. And mine too, by the way. I grew up in Blue County. There wasn't a Republican within 10 miles of where I was born. My mom, okay. My dad married my mom. My dad married up. And he was a Democrat. She was a Republican within 10 miles of my birthplace. But that Democratic working man's blue collar union, fiscally conservative, socially party. It certainly was that. That was the case where you grew up as well. That was a very Fast forward to when I was in the legislature, the chairman, a sitting Democratic chairman, were all small business owners, all Democrats, of course. They control right wingers. They signed the front of checks. They hired people. They used to make jokes with us. They could liberal for them. I mean, this was that Democratic Party, that Shore Party, that Western Maryland urban party. Many Democratic conservatives were included in that party. All three wings of the Democratic Party in your era and my era growing up. Today, that is no conservatives wiped out, moderates wiped out. You have a few liberals left, but the progressives, it's a very different Democratic Party than we grew up with.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, I sort of caught the tail end of that. You know, I remember how remarkable it was right around the time that I registered to vote, that in Talbot County down on the Eastern Shore where I grew up, finally reached a Republican majority. And it was actually front page news in the Star Democrat because there were people aghast by the idea that there might be Republicans.
Yeah.
You know, there might be enough Republicans to actually run things down there. And now, you know, as you well know, that's some of the reddest parts of the state. Those people are still the same folks that they were, you know, 20, 30 years ago. They just vote very Republican, and they are Republican identified now.
Well,
let me pivot real quick, though.
They had a party that welcomed conservative Democrats at the time.
Well, right. I mean, you had a coalition there, yeah. In fact, most people register as Democrats in order to get good conservative Democrats elected to office. Because you saw a lot of that. That strategy is long gone now. But Dwight's telling us we're short on time, but I want to touch on Pennsylvania real quick.
Please.
The news item from Harrisburg is this, which is meet the new governor, same as the old governor. Basically, we got. I've been miserable for 8 years of Tom Wolf. I'll be miserable for the next 4 years of Josh Shapiro. The good news for us is we do, as a party, we run the legislature. And so I think that they've got to be a little bit more combative than they've been with Tom Wolf. We've ceded too much territory on tax increases in Pennsylvania, and that's going to have its consequences. I think that's why there's an underlying lack of faith in the Pennsylvania Republican Party, is that the lip service versus the action don't match up always. And there's my frustration with our party. You know, we could have spent the last 2 years talking about the election, and we did. But that doesn't mean that when Tom Wolf demands another tax increase to add another, you know, $500 million to the Pennsylvania budget, that they don't roll over like puppies and let them scratch their stomachs. So we've really got to get our house under control here in Pennsylvania when it comes to spending. And I think that's when we can actually become a statewide party that can win a statewide election and mean it.
The Pennsylvania Party. Fetterman won. 2 words.
I hate to have that be the last word. I can.
How about Arizona,
So, Governor,
Nevada? We'll end on a high note. Arizona, Nevada, looking better
okay,
tonight.
that sounds good. And so, just looking ahead, when can we expect another book from you, Governor?
I can write them easily, but the marketing, the running around the country, well, I got to get permission from my wife.
Well, we're certainly look forward to that, and we thank you both for coming up on the show and sharing your thoughts on the, how shall I? It's not quite the morning after, but the evening after yesterday's election.
Scott, it's great to see you, my friend. Great to see you. Mark as well.
Likewise, it was.
Thank you.